Whether you're new to Exchange or you've used Exchange for quite some time, you may have the question, why use server roles? Especially if you've worked with Exchange in the past, you might be wondering, why did we have a need to split this up into various roles? Well, keep in mind, with legacy Exchange servers, the common practice was to deploy servers in dedicated roles. So you might utilize one Exchange server to be your mailbox server, another one would handle the bridgehead functionality, another one would be your front end, and you could split up what the functionality of the server was, but ultimately all of the code would be installed, so you're dealing with a larger footprint, which actually makes for a less secure system because there's a variety of unnecessary services and features that would be installed as well. So the Exchange team saw the need to divide the Exchange server up into 5 roles. Now, this started with Exchange 2007. The nice thing about this is that it only installs the required code for that particular role. That makes for a smaller footprint, it makes it more secure, and the management interfaces will change based on the server role, which in all honesty only really makes a difference when you're dealing with the Edge Transport server role. So we've reviewed the 5 server roles in a previous video. Let's do it again, and let's go a little bit deeper in explaining what each one of these roles can do for us. So to start with, there's the mailbox server role, there's the client access server role, there's the hub transport server role, and those server roles are the most important ones. And then we have the unified messaging server role and the edge transport server role. Every Exchange organization that you create will have to have the 3 main roles, that is the mailbox, hub transport, and client access server roles, in order to function. If any one of these roles is missing, you won't have a functional Exchange organization. When configuring a typical Exchange environment, if that Exchange environment is only going to handle the 3 main server roles, mailbox, hub transport, and client access server, that will work just fine. You'll put the server behind a firewall and connect directly to the internet. Now at that point, you may still use a hosted service on the internet to help with anti-spam, to help with antivirus protection, and so forth. There are hosted services out there to protect you before that mail comes into your Exchange organization. At the same time, you can enable anti-spam features on the hub transport server and also configure various transport rules to help protect your internal organization. However, you may decide to go with optional roles as well. One of the optional roles is unified messaging, which can also be placed on the same server as your other Exchange roles. You can install all of these roles on a single server, so long as that server has the ability to handle all of those server roles at the same time. And logically, you can install these server roles as separate servers. But in the case of these 4 server roles, those go before the firewall. So what that means is you're not going to put this in a perimeter network, in what they call a DMZ. The Edge Transport server, however, is a little different. We mentioned a moment ago that you might have services out on the internet to help protect you from spam, to help protect you from viruses. Well, you can also bring those services in-house with an Edge Transport server. However, the key to that is that you put the Edge Transport server in between the internet and a firewall, and then a firewall and your internal organization. So that Edge Transport server becomes your line of defense when it comes to spam and viruses and so forth that might be coming into your organization. And it's something that Microsoft does recommend if you have the ability, whether you host it in-house or go with a hosted solution. It's recommended that you have some form of protection to keep the spam and the viruses out of your organization itself. The more you can keep that at bay, the more you can keep that out of your Exchange organization, the easier your life as an Exchange administrator is going to be. Now, some get a little confused and they think maybe I should put my client access server role in the perimeter network as well. But that's a mistake. That perimeter network, which is also referred to as the DMZ or demilitarized zone, this is what companies deploy between the internet and their intranet to provide a more stable defense when it comes to individuals, hackers, and so forth that are trying to get through. However, Microsoft does not recommend putting the client access server out in the perimeter network. There's no real way to accomplish that. The reason why a lot of people think that they should do that is because perhaps they did something similar when it came to Exchange 2000 or 2003 front-end servers. But the client access server role with Exchange 2007 and 2010 is significantly different from a front-end server. So you can make the comparison. You can say, oh, the client access server is like a front-end server from Exchange 2000 and 2003. And yes, there are similarities. However, the client access server role is designed differently. And so you don't want to put that in your perimeter network. So it's easy to remember then. The only server that goes in that perimeter is the Edge Transport server. All the other Exchange server roles should be behind that firewall on the intranet. So to start with, let's talk about the mailbox server role. Now, this role is so important that we have dedicated an entire video covering the overview of the mailbox server role. And so at this point, we're just going to provide a few of the highlights of this role. For starters, the primary responsibility of the mailbox server role is to host the mailbox databases and provide storage and advanced scheduling services for your Outlook users. So even though you might think that the mailbox server role is really going to be all about individual recipient mailboxes, and you will spend a lot of time making sure that your mailboxes are all there and that people have what they need, but you're also going to need to understand mailbox databases. You need to understand the storage structure of Exchange in order to really know what's happening on your Exchange mailbox server and know how to recover in the event of a problem. Storage is also a big factor when it comes to the mailbox server role as opposed to other roles, and that's because obviously with each mailbox that you add to that role, you're going to need disk space to handle the mail for that user. So depending on whether or not you use quotas or not, which you can implement quotas on each mailbox. Let's say you give each mailbox a 1 gigabyte quota. So 100 mailboxes is 100 gigabytes of space. 200, 300, 400, how much space will you need on that mailbox server to accommodate all of the different mailboxes that you're going to have? And then in some cases, you may have databases open-ended where there are no quotas. And sometimes the mailboxes can really grow out of hand. So this is something you need to keep in mind with your mailbox server roles. This server will require the most amount of storage space out of all of your other server roles. Now, as far as calculating the amount of storage you're going to need and so forth, the Exchange team provides a calculator that you can download from the Microsoft Exchange team website. This calculator will help you to determine the amount of space that you're going to need for your mailbox server. Another thing that the mailbox server role does is it handles the public folder databases. Now, if you'd like to know more about public folders, we have an entire video on that in this introduction series. However, it's important to note that even though Exchange 2010 supports public folder databases, you can create and configure public folder databases, you can replicate public folder databases, really all of the support you could possibly need is included in Exchange 2010. However, Microsoft is trying to eliminate public folder use in the Exchange environment, and so they've warned us that future versions of Exchange may not have public folder support. They are encouraging companies to move towards SharePoint. However, if you don't like SharePoint, you can move towards something else. Just keep in mind that the public folders are going to be gone in future versions, so you can start preparing for that now. Now, another great feature to the mailbox server role is the fact that it has built-in high availability solutions. Now, this isn't new to Exchange. With earlier versions of Exchange, you had the ability to cluster Exchange servers together to provide higher availability. With Exchange 2007, there were solutions that required clustering and solutions that did not require clustering. And so you could pick and choose what you needed in your environment, or you could, of course, go with a third-party solution. Exchange 2010 completely rewrites the book on high availability for Exchange and starts us with the use of database availability groups, or DAG groups, and these provide the ability to have multiple replicas of your databases. You can actually have up to 16 copies, although that may seem a bit crazy in terms of redundancy, but each organization is different and has a different requirement. The good news is that you can configure a database availability group with actually only 2 servers so that you can replicate databases from server 1 over to server 2, and in the event server 1 goes down, server 2 will continue to function and pick up the slack with the copies that it has. And from the perspective of your users, they'll never even know the difference. They'll never know that they've been switched connectivity-wise from server 1 over to server 2. Now, in addition to high availability concerns, the mailbox server role is the one that you must be the most concerned about when it comes to backing up. You need to ensure that your data is safe. You need to ensure that you can restore mailboxes, databases, even messages if that's what your organization requires. So that mailbox server role is such an important one to stay focused on. As far as the ability to install the role, you can install the mailbox server role on a system with other roles. So you can put it with the hub transport, the client access server, the unified messaging server roles. You cannot put it with the edge transport server role. That server role stands on its own. It cannot be installed with other servers in the Exchange organization. Okay, so again, if you want to learn more about the mailbox server role, please watch the video that provides a deeper overview of the mailbox server role. Now the next role to consider is the unified messaging server role. Now you might say, well, that seems out of order. Usually we would put this one towards the end, maybe before the edge transport server role. But we're moving it up to right after the mailbox server role because this actually is such an intense role that it has its own video as well. And so going forward in this video, we're going to cover mostly the client access server role, the hub transport server role, and the edge transport server role. But the mailbox server has its own video and the unified messaging server role has its own video. And personally, I think the unified messaging server role is the coolest of all of the roles. I know some might disagree. They might say, no, it's got to be the mailbox server because, of course, that's the most important. Others might say, well, I really like the ability of the client access server role because it's the role that has all of the incoming connections from the outside, whether it be mobile devices or web browsers. But this unified messaging server role, it really caught my attention because it provides something new and unique to Exchange that also pulls us into a whole nother world, the world of telephony. And so what the unified messaging server role does is it provides the ability to have a universal inbox. And this includes your email, incoming faxes, voicemail. It puts it all in your inbox, which is really great. Now, you might say, okay, well, as far as email, that always went into my inbox. With incoming faxes, we could always go to a service provider to have that occur as well. But voicemail, see, that's really the key. What happens with a unified messaging server is it integrates with your telephony network. So let's say your company has a PBX. You might think, well, yeah, we have one and I don't touch it. Well, that's pretty typical actually, because the PBX really requires telephony knowledge. And if you're a network administrator, you may not have any telephony knowledge, and that's okay. You might have a little bit more experience with it if you have an IP PBX, which allows for connectivity to your packet switch network as well as to your internal IP-based network. But whether you have experience with telephony or not, it's important with the unified messaging server role that you understand some of the basics of how a telephone network works. And we cover that in another video. Now, if you have a legacy PBX, that may be fine, but you will need to install a voice over IP gateway in order to work with it. If, however, you're starting from scratch, then we recommend that you get an IP PBX, which is a single solution that will provide both telephony and unified messaging connectivity. One of the great things about the unified messaging server role is that you can configure an auto attendant which will help answer calls and direct them to the right voicemail. You can configure the auto attendant to be different languages depending on the location. It's really an amazing solution. Some of the special features of unified messaging include things like Outlook Voice Access, which allows you to call your inbox, and you can not only find out what your mail is, it will read the mail to you if you'd like it to, but you can also check your calendar. If you're going to be late for a meeting, you can say you're going to be late. It will update your calendar, and then others who are waiting for you at that meeting, they'll be able to see that you're going to be a few minutes late. Another great feature is voicemail preview. What happens is when that voicemail goes into your inbox, you get a preview of it. It will actually transcribe the voice into text so that you can see what that voicemail was all about. Now, it's not perfect. There are definitely times when there are errors in the translation, but in testing, it's actually been proven to be pretty good when it comes to voice to text. Some other features include Play on Phone, which is great for a situation where, let's say, you don't want to play your voicemail through your computer, through your laptop, or whatever for others to hear, and let's say you don't have your earbuds and you just don't want to do it that way. Well, you can ask your Outlook to call you and play the message on your own phone. And so those are just some of the features of the Unified Messaging Server role. There's really a whole list more that make this a valuable server, one that's worth implementing if you have the need and the desire to start branching out into another aspect of Exchange features. The next role we want to discuss is the Client Access Server role. Now, we could easily just go through this and say the Client Access Server role provides Outlook Web App, Exchange Active Sync, Exchange Web Services, POP and IMAP services, Outlook Anywhere, but really, that's assuming that you know what all of these features are. If you do, then you know that the Client Access Server role is incredible. If you don't, then you're probably missing out on what the Client Access Server role really provides. So let's start at the top. Outlook Web App. This was originally called Outlook Web Access. So the acronym stays the same, which is great, and you can see they love the acronyms here. But what is Outlook Web App? This is a feature that works off of Internet Information Server, and it allows you to access your mailbox through a web browser. Now, the great thing about Outlook Web App is that there are always enhancements with each release of Exchange. And so every time we get the next version of it, we see how much closer the Outlook Web App features mimic the Outlook client, the real client that you install on your desktop. And so that's really great. Some of the new features that have been enhanced in Outlook Web App for Exchange 2010 include things like chat, text messaging, mobile phone integration. There's an enhanced conversation view. So there's a lot that's been added, but one of the great things about Outlook Web App for Exchange 2010 is the ability for it to work on multiple browsers. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, I remember Outlook Web Access worked on multiple browsers before. There was a light version of it that worked for Firefox and Safari. That's true, but now with Exchange 2010, you can use Internet Explorer 6.0 and up, you can use Firefox, you can use Safari, you can even use Google's Chrome browser, and you get the full range of services that you would get if you used it with Internet Explorer 8.0. So Outlook Web App is certainly a great feature, and one of the nice things about it is it just works right out of the box. Now, there are configuration options that you can set, there are policies you can set too, and we're going to show you that in a moment, but the fact that it just works with the Client Access Server role is really a relief that you don't have to jump through hoops in order to make it work. Now, the next thing that the Client Access Server role provides is Exchange Active Sync. This allows you to synchronize data between a mobile device and Exchange 2010. You can synchronize your email, contacts, calendar information, tasks. So this is really an incredible feature. Now, depending on the mobile device that you're using, let's say you're using Windows Mobile 5.0 with the Messaging Security Feature Pack, or perhaps a higher version of Windows Mobile, then in that case, the mobile device will support what's called Direct Push. This is a technology that's built into Exchange ActiveSync that allows your device to be continuously synchronized with your Exchange mailbox. Now, that's important to mention because BlackBerry devices have supported Direct Push for a long time. And so sometimes persons that are not aware of the updates, the enhancements to Exchange, may think, oh, well, you need a BlackBerry if you want to have Direct Push. Other than that, you have to pull your information down from the Exchange server. But that's not the case. Direct Push has been part of Exchange ActiveSync for a while now, so it's good to know where we stand in terms of some of these features, because sometimes people get it into their mind, oh, this is a technology that's only supported by this one vendor, and then we never update our knowledge when it comes to other vendors that now support that technology. Well, certainly Microsoft stood up and took notice when BlackBerry could give Direct Push, and so right away they implemented it into their Exchange world. So this is something that certainly Exchange 2010 offers for mobile devices running 5.0 and higher. Now, as for Exchange Web Services, this is something that has been included with Exchange 2010 that provides the functionality to enable client applications to communicate with the Exchange server. Exchange Web Services is actually one of several services that are included with Exchange 2010. There's the Auto Discover, which is a SOAP service. There's the Auto Discover POX service. There's the Unified Messaging Web Service. So Exchange Web Services is one of these services that are included. And essentially it's an XML messaging interface that allows you to manage Exchange store items and access Exchange functionality from your client applications. Now, we're not going to go into any real great depth on that. The fact that those services exist through the client access server role is good to know. As far as taking advantage of those services, that's something that would require a lot more discussion and would take us off of the administrative track and more into a developmental phase of discussion. So we're going to just leave it as it is, that client access server role provides Exchange Web Services. Now, the client access server role also provides POP and IMAP support. So typically you might be familiar with Outlook in your organization, that the clients are called MAPI clients. And of course with Outlook Web App, the clients are HTTP clients. However, POP3 and IMAP clients are also supported. So perhaps you're using, let's say, a version of Windows Mail or Windows Live Mail if you're using Windows 7 and you've downloaded the Live Essentials pack that goes with that. So you're using a POP client, really. You can use that to connect up to an Exchange server as well. You might use POP clients like Mozilla's Thunderbird or others. You might use IMAP clients. These are all just different types of email clients. And so in some cases, you're not connected to an Exchange server and you don't get all of the functionality of being connected to an Exchange server as a MAPI client. In some cases, let's say you're connected to an internet service provider that only gives you POP or IMAP support. So if you're setting up a server that is only going to give POP or IMAP support, well, it's the client access server that provides those features, provides those services so that a person can still have a mailbox, but ultimately they're going to connect up and pull their mail down, and they won't get all the extra bells and whistles that comes from being a MAPI client. Outlook Anywhere is another feature that the client access server provides, and this lets your clients that use, let's say, Outlook 2003, 2007, or even Outlook 2010 connect to the Exchange server over the internet using what's called RPC, which is Remote Procedure Call, RPC over HTTP. So without getting into the depth of how the technology works and how the RPCs or Remote Procedure Calls are wrapped with an HTTP layer and going into how traffic traverses the network firewalls and so forth, the Outlook Anywhere feature provides you the ability to use Outlook at home as if you're working directly with an Exchange server in the office. So you might say, well, I use Outlook Web App for that, but you don't get all of the features of Outlook in Outlook Web App. So you might want to use your Outlook client, and Outlook Anywhere allows you to do that. But remember, it's the client access server role that's going to provide that functionality. Okay, now let's move forward and talk about some of the other things that the client access server role provides. For example, the client access server role provides free busy data through the availability service. Now, free busy data, that's something that we may have heard in previous versions of Exchange, and we may never have understood what does it mean, free busy. But it's basically a simple term to describe availability, and so they changed the name. The availability service provides consistent and up-to-date information on things like a worker's calendar and meeting schedule, information about services that are available. So sometimes there are individuals that you want to check on to see if they're available. You want to look at their calendar, you want to know what their time frame is, and then you can determine whether or not you can configure an appointment with them, but you need to be able to check to see if they are available. So that's one use of free busy information. The availability service will also provide access to automatic reply messages that users will send when they're out of the office, or let's say if they're away for a period of time. So the availability service takes care of things like that. And in addition to the availability service, the CAS server role also allows clients to access automatic configuration settings through the Auto Discover service. So Outlook clients and certain mobile phones that have the ability can receive their profile settings directly from the server by using the client's domain credentials. The server updates the device or system automatically, and that's really a great feature because, first of all, with the first connect of a client to the server, you don't have to go and handle the configuration. It will just do it automatically. Second of all, if anything changes, and let's say you move a mailbox, the user's mailbox can automatically reconfigure itself because of the Auto Discover service. Now, as far as the clients that are allowable, well, this is something that only Outlook 2007 and Outlook 2010, as well as certain supported mobile phones, can handle. So if you have Outlook 2003, it doesn't work with the Auto Discover service. So essentially, when you use your Outlook 2007 or 2010 client, and if you are joined up to a domain, the user's domain account is used. If not, it will ask you for an account and a password. It will take that information and it will automatically configure your user profile. It will locate the user's mailbox and it will connect the two up. And so, as I said, if a user's Exchange information becomes changed in any way, let's say in the event a user's mailbox is moved, then Outlook will contact the Auto Discover service and it will automatically update the user's profile to connect the user back up with their new mailbox location. Again, all of this depends on the client access server role. And last but not least, there's the offline address book, which is also handled by the client access server role. Now, basically, this is a copy of an address book that has been downloaded so that an Outlook user can access that information, even though the user may be disconnected from the server. You can really micromanage this as an administrator. You can actually pick and choose which address books can be made available to which users, and when they work offline, that would be the address book that they're given. You can also determine the method of deployment for these offline address books. So you might choose web-based distribution or even public folder distribution. Okay, so now that you have a good understanding of all of the different things that the client access server role really provides and how essential it really is. In fact, it is a server that you have to install in order for your Exchange to work at all. You need to at least have the three primary servers, which is the mailbox server, the client access server, and the hub transport server. So this is one of your key servers. And now you can see why, because it provides so many features here that are absolutely necessary. In fact, one thing that we don't want to forget to mention is that even though you see all of these different provisions of the client access server role, you might think that it only has to do with external connections or internet-oriented connections to the client access server. But you can start to see with the availability service, the auto discover service, the offline address book service, that there's actually quite a bit of connectivity to your in-house clients, your MAPI clients. In actuality, there have been some other changes that have been made behind the scenes with the client access server role in Exchange 2010. So we had a client access server with Exchange 2007, and it did a lot of great stuff, but there were still features that were handled by the Exchange mailbox servers. But that has been changed with 2010. With all clients that want to access their mailbox data, they have to go through the client access server first. There are two new services that I'll just mention briefly. There's an RPC client access service and an address book service. And these services provide the functionality that we need on the client access server that at one time resided on the mailbox servers in previous versions of Exchange, including Exchange 2007. So this client access server role is not just for your internet clients, but also your internal MAPI clients at this point. They've really changed the architecture to give it a more integral role with your MAPI clients. Now at this point, let's take a look at the Exchange Management Console. Let's look at a few of the policy configuration settings and some of the other settings for both the organization side and the server side to configuring your client access server. Okay, so here we are on our Exchange server, on the New York Exchange server that we have configured with the Mailbox, Client Access, Hub Transport, and Unified Messaging server roles. Now, we look here at the organization configuration level, and we've selected Client Access already, and you can see there isn't much to do on an organization-wide level. We have Outlook Web App Mailbox policies and Exchange ActiveSync mailbox policies. Still though, these are very cool things to configure, very important, and it's interesting if we just take a look at what each of these policies offers, you'll be able to quickly see that the ability to create a policy and then enforce that policy on your users will really have a dramatic effect on the amount of control that you can have when it comes to your Exchange organization, and that's very important. So here you can see there's a default policy that's automatically created. If we open that up, you can use the default or you can go with your own policy. It's completely up to you. And then when you configure users, you can choose these policies and you can determine which policy you want to apply to which group of users. Okay, so the General tab doesn't really say much, just General, and then gives the name of the policy. Here we have the Segmentation tab, and here you can change the policy to disable some of the features that Outlook Web App has enabled by default. So for example, address lists, calendar, contacts, journal, junk email filtering. So you might say, well, why would I want to disable any of those features? Well, it's completely up to you and your organization. For example, text messaging, instant messaging. These are things you may want to disable in your organization. So you go right here to the Segmentation tab. You can change it for the default policy, or you can create additional policies and then apply them to the users that you want to disable this feature for. Some other options here include public and private computer file access, and you can see they're the same exact settings for each. The point is that at times you may be accessing files from your Outlook web app, and in that case, if you're public, then you're out on the internet somewhere and you're accessing it in through a firewall. So here you see direct file access. It says enable direct file access, and then you can customize. Direct file access allows users to open files that are attached to email messages or files that are stored in, let's say, a Windows SharePoint Services library or on a Windows file share. So you can manage this, and here if we click Customize, you can see we can choose to allow certain types, to block certain types, to force a save where the user must save it to disk before opening instead of simply opening right where it is. And you recall when you connect with Outlook Web App that you choose if this is a public or shared computer or if this is a private computer. So depending on which choice you make, those are the settings that it's going to choose. So you can configure these to be exactly the same, or you can specify distinctions between the public and the private use of these. So here if we click Allow, under Always Allow, you can see all of the different file types that are allowed by default, and you can edit that. You can delete any one of these if you don't want to allow it. You can add additional types. This is something you can do for the Allow, Block, or Save sections. For unknown files, you can force save, you can allow, or you can block. Now here, web-ready document viewing, that's something a little different. So we have the direct file access, and then you have web-ready document viewing. You notice it says enable web-ready document viewing, and then it says force web-ready document viewing when a converter is available, and then specify supported document types. Basically, web-ready document viewing allows users to access file attachments in the Outlook web app. So let's say you don't have Microsoft Word installed. You're using a browser and you want to access a document that is a Word document. So you want to view the document directly in the Outlook web app. Here if we click Supported, you can see that all of the major applications are supported for Outlook web app. And so this is a great feature. You have the ability to quickly see a document right from within the browser. So these two features together, direct file access and web-ready document viewing, they really make it a lot easier for you to work with documents when you're using Outlook web app. And so really that's all you need in a policy. The control here as well as the segmentation control here, you can configure the policy and then determine to whom that policy should apply. So that's one feature. The other feature is over here, Exchange ActiveSync mailbox policies. Again, we see that there's a default policy. And if we open that up, you can see that there are several tabs. Now, for starters, allow non-provisionable devices. So there are times when you have an organization with mixed devices. It's not always the case that everybody has the same device, and sometimes there are devices that are not provisionable. In other words, there are devices that may not be able to apply the policy settings that you're about to configure. Now, if you deselect this option, then devices that do not meet the standards that you're hoping for here will not be able to connect up with your system. So it's important to allow non-provisionable devices if you want to make sure that even legacy mobile devices can connect. Now you might say, well, no, I don't want that at all. I want to make sure that this policy is applied, and so you'll want to deselect that. Here you see refresh interval in hours as far as the refresh interval for your mobile devices and this policy. We have password, which is really great. You can require a password for your users to connect up, and if you do that, You can require an alphanumeric password. If you do that, you can configure the minimum number of complex characters, enable password recovery, require encryption on device, require encryption on storage card. We could spend a lot of time describing each and every one of these, and actually in a future series we'll do just that. We'll spend quite a bit of time going through all of these. But here you can see that you can have simple passwords, number of failed attempts allowed, minimum password length. All of this can be configured here on the policy. Sync settings. Here you can include past calendar items or email items, and in this case it's set to all, but you can actually change that if you'd like. You can limit the email size in kilobytes. Here you see allow direct push when roaming. We've talked about this as far as whether or not a device has the ability to handle direct push. Allow HTML formatted email, allow attachments to be downloaded to device, and if so, you can determine a maximum attachment size. So this is just showing you the amount of strength that you have by using these ActiveSync policies. With each new release of Exchange, starting with Exchange 2007 and then with Service Pack 1 for 2007, each time they enhance these features, you get more and more properties that you can configure. So here we see device, and look at all of these great features. Here you can choose to disallow the camera, disallow Wi-Fi. That's on the mobile device. By setting this policy and having it apply to that device, let's say this is your mobile device that you have provided to the user. You're the company. You have the right to configure how it runs. But all of these devices have these cameras these days. So you might say that is a legal hassle just waiting to happen. It's happening all over the world. People with these cameras are taking pictures and using all of that inappropriately, or perhaps exactly as it was designed. And that's going to cost your company money. So one little click of a button and you will disallow the camera. The camera will not function. You can turn off internet sharing, turn off remote desktop, all of that with a click of a button. The only thing to keep in mind is this little footnote here. It says the ability to modify policies on this tab is a premium Exchange ActiveSync feature that requires an Exchange Enterprise Client Access license for each mailbox policies are restricted on. So these features here for this policy will only work for Enterprise Client Access licenses. Up here we have device applications which have a similar footnote here. Here you can say allow browser, allow consumer mail, allow unsigned applications, allow unsigned installation packages, and then over here we have other, which again has the same footnote, and here you can allow or block applications on that mobile device. So again, a tremendous amount of control off of just this little policy here for ActiveSync. And you create it at the organization configuration level, and then you can apply it down to your users. Now, under server configuration, we also have the client access server role here, and you can see it's a little different. Here, instead of policies, we're looking at Exchange ActiveSync, Exchange Control Panel, Outlook Web App, Offline Address Book Distribution, POP3 and IMAP. And for each of those tabs, there are settings, there are properties that you can go into by selecting and going into the properties. And here you can see for the most part there isn't much that you can change when it comes to at least the offline address book distribution. For Outlook Web App, you can see that the properties are a little bit more extensive for Outlook Web App, whether it's public computer file access, and again, direct file access or web-ready document viewing. This is on the server itself, and then private computer file access, remote file servers. So we can really go on for a long time talking about all of these different features. Again, you're going to want to look to a future series that will drill down deeper into how to configure and work with all of these client access server features. This was just the overview to show you what a client access server is all about. What does a client access server do for your organization? Why do you need one? And then from there your knowledge will certainly grow. Now let's go back to the slides and let's talk about the Hub Transport Server for a little bit. Now let's talk about the Hub Transport Server role. This server is deployed within your Active Directory forest, so it is not something you put on the perimeter. So you don't want to get this confused with the Edge Transport Server role. That is something you put on the perimeter, and we're going to talk about that server role next. When it comes to the Hub Transport Server role, however, It mimics very closely what the Edge Transport Server does. In fact, you might say that it has a little bit more flexibility because it's designed to work without an Edge Transport Server. So you'll find that the Edge Transport Server, it does some of the same things as the Hub Transport Server, but it's meant for its own specific purpose, as opposed to the Hub Transport Server, which can also put on the Edge Transport hat if it needs to. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. As far as where it's deployed, it is deployed within the Active Directory forest. And this is a role that has to be deployed if you want your mailbox server and your client access server to work. So it's part of the typical installation. It's a necessity for your Exchange organization. Now, the purpose of the role is it handles mail flow within the organization. The way that mail flow is handled is actually something that they changed up in Exchange 2007. They started working right off of your Active Directory. So Active Directory makes site connections, and it understands the flow of your organization in terms of where replication should take place. So if you have objects that need to be replicated, it looks at your router structure, it looks at, let's say, branch offices, the WAN connection, the speed of the connection, the amount of stress bandwidth-wise on those connections, and it designs a topology that it works with. Now you can get in there and you can start playing around with that topology. You can make changes to it if you'd like. However, typically Microsoft recommends with the later versions of Server that you leave it alone. With Server 2000, if you're a Windows Server 2000 guru, then you knew that you had to get in there and you had to start making some changes. And that's because there was a tool that was used to create the site topology and it didn't work very well. But with Server 2003, R2 of Server 2003, and then 2000 and 2008 R2, they've enhanced these tools so that you can trust them a little bit better. And Microsoft wants you to do that. Now, at the same time, your Exchange now comes into the mix, and it's going to rely on that site topology for how it sends messages through your organization. Does that work for you? Well, hopefully it does. However, if it doesn't, you still have the ability to go in there and change the connectors, not necessarily for your Active Directory, although you can, but for your Exchange environment at least. The nice thing about that is in a larger environment where you might have Exchange administrators and Active Directory administrators, you don't want to have to fight between you as far as setting up these connectors and where things should flow. So if you have a disagreement with the Active Directory team and you want your mail to flow a different way, being that you're in control of Exchange, well, you can go in there and you can adjust the connectors for your Exchange organization. However, assuming everything's working great for your Active Directory, you would leave that alone and let the Hub Transport Server do its job, which is simply sending mail through the organization. Now, what this means is that all mail coming into and going out from your organization or between mailboxes within your organization will go through the Hub Transport Server. Now, one of the great things about that is it provides you the ability to establish transport rules. We're going to take a look at transport rules in a moment, and you'll see that the great thing about transport rules is you can establish a rule on the Hub Transport side and not worry about mail slipping through. Being that all mail goes to a Hub Transport Server before it goes anywhere else, you know that that rule is going to be applied to your mail. So you might say, well, okay, well, what would I use a transport rule for? Well, let's take one simple example. I did some work for a company in Manhattan, an accounting firm that had to put a little disclaimer at the end of all of their emails. Now, the thing was, they wanted email between people in the company to just be normal. So if I sent the person next door to me an email, it wouldn't put the little disclaimer down at the bottom. But they wanted to ensure that anyone outside the company that received email would get this legal disclaimer. So they thought about this and they thought about, well, maybe we'll just ask everybody to put it at the bottom of their emails, or maybe we'll make it part of their signatures. But again, there was no way to enforce that legal disclaimer then be a part of every single email. So some were going to go out properly and others would obviously, due to user error, be forgotten about. With a transport rule, however, we were able to put this little disclaimer at the bottom of all of the emails without the users being involved at all. Because every email that went through that server, if it was heading out of the organization, it got that little disclaimer. So we're going to show you how to do that with transport rules in just a few moments here, but you can see how powerful that feature can be. Now, another great feature is journaling. Journaling also ties in with legal compliance because there are a variety of different rules out there for companies that say that you have to retain your email for a period of time. They want to be able to check back through email in the event the company has a problem, and they want to be able to see who's really involved in the problem by checking through a person's email. So when you're working with a company, that email is not really yours, it's something that the company is responsible for, and so they may journal it. Now, what journaling does is it makes a copy of your email. And you can do this on different levels. You can do this on a mailbox, you can do this on a database, you can do this for the entire organization. So, journaling is a very important feature that the Hub Transport Server role handles as well. Another important feature of the Hub Transport Server is edge synchronization. Now, this is only necessary if you have an edge transport server. So if you don't, then you don't have to worry about the synchronization. If you do, however, then you're going to need to synchronize the edge transport server with the Hub Transport Server in your organization. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail when we talk about the edge transport server role. Another feature is anti-spam agents. Now, when we look at the Hub Transport Server role, you're going to notice that there are no anti-spam agents. So we're not just tricking you here. Those agents are only installed and are only configurable if you ask them to be. So I'm going to show you how to install those because many of you out there may not use an Edge Transport Server. When we install the Edge Transport Server, those agents are automatically installed. But with the Hub Transport Server, if you decide not to use an Edge Transport Server, you're going to run a PowerShell script that will install those agents, and then you'll be able to work with them from within the Hub Transport Server side. Okay, so here we are on our Exchange server. We're back on our New York Exchange server. And let's say you have a situation where you don't want to use an Edge Transport server, but you do want the anti-spam agents installed on the Hub Transport server here. So we said that we could do this, that we could install them. Let's look first of all at our Exchange files. Let's look for the scripts that we have included. Okay, we can see the scripts there. And you see if we scroll down, there's one called Install Anti-Spam Agents. If I just double click on this, it shows you some information about what the code is, what it does. It installs the following agents, and it doesn't take any parameters. It says you just have to kick off the script. So for starters, if we hold the Shift key down and we right click, we can copy as path. Then we're going to go back to our Exchange Management Shell, and let's scroll down so you can see it a bit. And we're going to change directory command there. So we'll just go to that, and then if we want to kick it off, we can type period / install anti-spam agents.ps1 and hit enter. And I made a mistake. Okay, that's a good reminder. Let's go back. It's install, and let's let's put the dash in there, anti-spam agents. That's a separate thing. Install dash anti-spam agents.ps1, and we hit enter. Now it tells us that we need to restart the Microsoft Exchange Transport Service for changes to take effect. So let's do that. We'll go to our services. We'll find the Microsoft Exchange Transport Service. Here it is. And we will restart it. Okay, and so now if we go back to our Exchange Management Console, And now you can see that we have that anti-spam folder here with all of the settings that we have on the Edge Transport server. So it's good to note that that's under server configuration, hub transport. It's not an organization configuration setting. It's something that you have to enable on individual hub transport servers. Obviously, an important aspect of hub transport is the ability to send and receive email. So in order to accomplish that, there are these connectors. Now, we're going to talk about in a moment how the send connector is actually non-existent on your hub transport server. And so you might have a great Exchange organization that's working just fine, sending email from user A to user B, but if they're not able to send email to the internet, well, then you have a problem, right? So we're going to talk about creating a send connector, and as far as receive connectors are concerned, there are some receive connectors that are automatically built in for you, and as you add additional servers to the mix, whether they be more hub transport servers or as you connect up with edge transport servers, you'll see that these connectors become very important in terms of that mail flow that we were talking about. If you only have one hub transport server, then in reality the only way mail is coming in is through that one or going out through that one. So there's really not much involved with connectors at that point. But when your organization begins to sprawl out and you have more hub transport servers, maybe multiple edge transport servers, then the connectors become a little bit more important. The hub transport server role also involves email address policies that we'll take a look at and accepted domains. So you might wonder, well, what's an accepted domain? We're going to talk about accepted domains as well as relay domains. We'll talk about remote domains. So this is just something that involves the flexibility of your Exchange server to handle different design types for organizations that may have multiple domain names or organizations that may have mail coming into the Exchange server and need that mail to be relayed off somewhere else, either internally or externally. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so we've talked enough about the hub transport server role. Let's go take a quick look at how this works on an organization and server-wide level, and then we'll come back to the slides because we need to map out a send connector in order to send mail to the outside world. We're going to talk about that a little bit because it's one of the little hang-ups that people have when they set up an Exchange server, especially if it's for the first time. Okay, so we're on our Exchange server, the New York Exchange server that we set up. And here you can see we're under server configuration, hub transport. Now you'll note that there really isn't much here in terms of configuration. We have receive connectors and we have the link up here where we can actually make changes when it comes to this particular server itself. You do that by right-clicking and choosing properties or going to the properties here off the actions pane. And then from here we have system settings, we have limits, log settings. So there is a little bit we can do here, but not really much. No, most of the hub transport server work is done on the organization configuration level. And so here you can see we have accepted domains, which we're going to talk about in a moment. We have remote domains. We have edge subscriptions, global settings. We have journal rules, which as you can see there are none to start with. Transport rules, email address policies, where you see we have a default policy, but for the most part, you can see we have nothing really set up for our hub transport server. So if you wanted to make changes, we would start here on the actions pane, and you can see new transport rule, new journal rule, new send connector. So this is something that will require a little bit of time and effort, but to start with, your Exchange organization just seems to work. Let's talk for a moment about this new send connector feature, because you're going to find when it's really time to make your Exchange environment live on the internet, live for your users to send and receive mail, a send connector is going to be an invaluable thing because without it, especially if you don't have an edge server, your user's mail is not going to get very far. Let's go back to the slides for a moment, talk about this, and then we'll come back and set up a new send connector. Okay, so let's talk about send connectors, and especially let's talk about the asterisk send connector. Now, this is a situation that comes up pretty often. A person will call me and say, you know, I set up Exchange, I did exactly what you said, I've read your book or I've seen your videos and I set up Exchange and it's working great. and I cannot send an email to the outside world. What am I missing? And you know, it dawned on me that I don't usually tell people what to do to create the send connector to get this out to the outside world. But basically, you create a send connector with an asterisk. You're going to see what that means in a moment, but it literally is an asterisk. And what happens is the server, when it gets mail, when the Hub Transport server gets mail, it says, this is mail that's not from my domain. So if it doesn't say, as in the case of our scenario, globamantics.com, in the email address, if it says something like Microsoft.com, then it says, okay, well, this isn't for me, so I have to send it somewhere. But if you don't have a send connector, it doesn't know where to send it. Now, the cool thing about this is that if you've set up an Edge Transport server, the Edge Transport server typically knows what to do with the mail. So once it gets that mail, it sends it out because it usually has the asterisk send connector created for it. But the Hub Transport server doesn't. Part of the reason for that is because Microsoft is hoping you set up an Edge Transport server and allow your mail to go through that, because that's certainly going to be the safer solution as far as they're concerned. But let's say you're a smaller organization that doesn't want an Edge Transport server. Well, then in that case, you need that send connector to have the asterisk. So we're going to jump back over to the server and create this asterisk-oriented send connector. But at the same time, you might be wondering, what about email from the outside world? How does it come into my Exchange organization? Well, that involves the public DNS. You need to create an MX record that points off to your receiving Exchange server. Now, as far as configuring your public DNS, really that depends on what you use to accomplish that. Do you control your own DNS servers? Do you have a hosting company control your DNS servers? What type of interface do they provide you in order for you to make those changes? So for example, if you go through one of these sites like GoDaddy or one of the hosted sites, they typically provide you with a very simple browser-based configuration tool where you can go in there and you can create an MX record that points off to your Exchange server. But remember, you don't want to do that until you're sure you have an up and running Exchange environment that's functioning smoothly before you start diverting mail into that Exchange environment. You need to make sure you have your mailboxes set up, otherwise mail is going to start bouncing. So you don't want to turn on the reality switch with an MX record until you're sure that that Exchange server is ready to handle the mail coming into it for all of the users in your organization that should be receiving that mail. The same is true of configuring the send connector. You don't want to turn on the send connector until you're ready to also set the MX record, mainly because if you start sending emails out from that organization, people are going to start responding to those emails from the outside world. Well, if they respond, they're not going to be able to get back in to your people because you don't have an MX record that points them in the right direction. So these are little things you have to think about when you're working with a real live solution as opposed to a test or lab environment. Okay, so let's jump back over and let's take a look at creating a send connector. Okay, so we're on our Exchange server again. We're under the Hub Transport node under Organization Configuration, and we're on the Send Connectors tab. As you can see, there's nothing here. Now let's say this organization was ready to take that step and start sending emails out to the internet. Well, we would start that off by clicking New Send Connector. And as far as the name is concerned, we can name it whatever we like. In this case, we'll call it Internet Sending. And then it says, select the intended use for this send connector. Custom, internal, internet, or partner. We're going to choose internet. And notice what it says. Internet send connectors are used to send email to the internet. This connector will be configured to use DNS MX records to route email. So you might say, oh, well, I have to set up MX records. Well, you do. You have to set up MX records so that mail coming into your organization is sent in the right direction. But as far as mail going out, the nice thing is if you're sending email, let's say to Microsoft.com, the fact that you have a server that is connected to the internet that knows how to find a DNS server of its own and knows how to send out from this server, well, when mail hits that server, it will use DNS MX records that are already out there on the internet to route that email. So you really don't have to do anything else once you set up this send connector. We click Next. and it asks us for an address space to which this connector will route mail. We click Add, and we simply put in the asterisk. We can include all subdomains, we can change the cost. So you have your send connector created. Now you'll note this option here, Scoped Send Connector. What is a scoped send connector, you might be asking? Well, in actuality, when you create a send connector, initially it can be used by all Hub Transport servers in the Exchange organization. However, if you select this checkbox, what you're basically saying is that this send connector can only be used by Hub Transport servers in the same Active Directory site. So this is a design and an implementation decision. In our case, we only have the one Hub Transport server, so we don't have to worry about this, but it's good to know that you have that ability to configure your send connectors to work the way you want. We click Next. Now at this point, you can actually determine the route of your mail through smart hosts. You can use the external DNS lookup settings on the transport server, or you can use the default, which is domain name system MX records, to route mail automatically. That's the easiest one to work with, and that's the default, so we'll leave it at that. We'll click Next. It says associate this connector with the following Hub Transport servers, and you can see it's already selected the one that we have, so in our case this is just fine. This is the source server for this send connector. We click Next, and here we see the configuration. We click New. And we're all set. So at this point, clients that are connected up to this Exchange organization, clients that have the ability to send mail from their Outlook through this Exchange server, will now have the ability to also send mail out to the internet. This send connector will send mail using DNS MX records. So again, don't set this up right away. Make sure you do all of your other work first before you make your Exchange server live when it comes to sending mail out to the internet. Now let's go back to the slides for a moment, because we want to talk a little bit about new transport rules and see the way these rules work before we create one of our own. Okay, so in discussing transport rules, the important thing to remember is that transport rules will work because all mail must eventually go in and out of a Hub Transport server. Even if you use an Edge Transport server, mail is still going to hit one of your Hub Transport servers within your organization. And so at an organizational level, you can create these transport rules. Now, a lot of this may look familiar to you if you've worked with setting up rules for your Outlook. But of course, we're talking about a whole different level. We're talking about a much more administrative level here. But the concept itself may not be foreign to you. So the first step is to configure a condition. And that condition can be any number of different things, whether it's mail coming from a specific user or a group, or leaving your organization, or meeting certain criteria. That's what the condition is all about. Then you establish an action. So if mail going through that Hub Transport server meets up with a certain condition or criteria, then this action is going to be taken. So for example, add disclaimer. So if something meets the condition, you're going to add the disclaimer. And then the last thing we need to do is provide exceptions. Now, this is something that you don't have to do. You only provide an exception if it matters. So the transport rule that we're going to create, and remember, this is just one example. There are literally hundreds of different transport rules that you might create for your organization. But we're going to show you one example, and then from there it's up to you to determine where this might apply in your organization. So we're going to say as a condition, all outgoing mail, not incoming, but outgoing mail, will have a disclaimer appended to the mail, not prepended. We're going to see how there's a difference, but appended to the email, unless it's going to a specific user, and we'll determine who that user is when we make the rule. So now let's go back over to our Exchange server, and let's see how we would walk through the creation of this particular rule. Okay, so here we are on the Exchange server again, and we're under the Organization Configuration under Hub Transport. We're looking at the Transport Rules tab, and we're going to click the action New Transport Rule. To start with, we'll give it a simple name. Sometimes the name alone is enough, but sometimes we need to put in a comment so that we know what this rule is really all about without having to follow it from beginning to end. So it's good to keep the comment up to date so that it's easy to figure out what the rule is supposed to do. Here we can disable the rule by deselecting the checkbox. By leaving this enabled, then as soon as we create the rule, it's going to go into effect. So that's completely up to you. If you need to keep a rule, let's say, offline, you can deselect the little checkbox here. So we click Next. And so here you can see the conditions and look at all of the different conditions that exist. That's why it's impossible for us to tell you exactly how to create a transport rule for every single situation, because every situation is going to be different. So here, from people, from a member of a distribution list, and so on. Actually, in our case, we're going to say sent to users that are inside or outside the organization or partners. So if we click that checkbox, you notice that step 2 here is edit the rule description by clicking an underlined value. So here it says sent to users that are inside the organization, but in actuality, in our case, we want this rule to apply to messages that are sent to users that are outside the organization. So we click the link, and then we get this drop down, and here we can choose from amongst the 4 different settings. In this case, we want outside the organization, and we say OK. So that's really our only condition. Any email that leaves our organization goes to individuals outside the organization we want this rule to apply to. So we click Next. Okay, so what exactly do we want to have applied? Again, there's a lot of different information here that if we scroll down, we have a variety of different actions that we can take. In this case, we want to append disclaimer text, and we're going to select that. Now you notice we're setting it to append. If we click that link, we could choose prepend. That means it goes at the top of the email instead of the bottom, but that's not normally the way things are done, so in this case we're leaving it at append. It'll be at the bottom of the email. And then here, disclaimer text. This rule really cannot be applied. You'll notice the little pencil. It's letting us know that there's some kind of a problem if we try to apply this before the pencil disappears. Well, we need to actually include disclaimer text. There's nothing here. So let's type in our disclaimer. And now certainly we can add more to that. We say OK, and here we have the text there. Now in the event we're unable to apply this to an email, here it says wrap. We can choose to wrap it, ignore it, or reject. In this case we're going to choose reject, because we must have that legal disclaimer put with each and every email. So we click Next. And now we have exceptions. So we're looking at exceptions, and maybe we don't have any exceptions. We want this always to apply. But look at all of the different exception options we can choose from. So here, if we go back up to the top, and if we say except when the message is sent to, and we can choose people, and we can add who those people might be. So even though the administrator is actually in-house, we're going to leave it as administrator just because it's easier to do that. And now we have a full rule. We click Next. And there we have it. We click Finish. And there's our rule. Now you note there's a priority level. If we had multiple rules and we wanted them to apply in different priorities so that one takes place over another, we can actually configure different priority levels. If we open up the rule, note we can change the comments anytime. We can change any of these different options as far as, let's say we don't really want this exception because we don't really need to worry about an exception. We want it applied to everything, and we can update the rule. Nice and easy. And so you don't want to go crazy with transport rules. You don't want to have a billion of them, but it's a good idea to have a few transport rules to control the flow of mail a little better. The other set of rules that you may want to take into consideration are journal rules, which are great because, again, we talked about earlier the need to have a copy of information. So here you can see it's a very simple rule. You can set up a rule name, and then the scope can be global, where it's all messages, internal for internal messages only, external for messages with an external sender or recipient. You can journal messages for recipient and then choose a specific recipient, and then enable the rule. So this is a very simple way to configure journaling or copying of content. The journal reports themselves you can send to an email address, and let's say you would send that to an administrative email address or even to a journal email address, and then you can choose which recipients you're going to journal. So that information would be copied off to the recipient journal email address. The next thing we want to talk about is accepted domains. Now, if we click the link here, you notice we already have an accepted domain. So for starters, what exactly is an accepted domain? Well, according to Microsoft, an accepted domain is any SMTP namespace, which stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol namespace, for which a Microsoft Exchange organization sends or receives email. Okay, so we know that Globomantics then would be an accepted domain, but you note that there are three different categories. There's authoritative, internal relay, and external relay. So what's the difference between each one of these? Being that any given namespace as an accepted domain can only be one of these three different types. So as far as authoritative domains, these are domains where the Exchange organization literally hosts mailboxes. There are email addresses that connect to mailboxes within this organization. So we know in this case this is definitely an authoritative domain then, because email is delivered to recipients in this Exchange organization. Globomantics.com has users. So if someone sends an email to Jenny@globomantics.com, well, the Exchange organization is configured with a mailbox for Jenny so that that email will come into the organization and go to her mailbox. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't appreciate, don't realize, is the flexibility of an Exchange server in this regard. Okay, so Globomantics.com is an authoritative domain. There are mailboxes, but an organization can have more than one authoritative domain configured. So what if we have Globomantics and then we have international Globomantics.com as well? You can actually configure a secondary authoritative domain for international Globomantics.com that the Exchange organization can handle. So you'd have two different authoritative domains, and then from there you can configure different sets of mailboxes. So before we go too deep into that, we'll leave that discussion for a later time. But it's good for you to know that that is the flexibility of accepted domains and authoritative domains. Then you have internal relay domains and external relay domains. So when it comes to internal relay domains, this is where the Exchange organization hosts some, but maybe not all of the mailboxes that use that domain. Some call this a shared SMTP namespace. So you can see here that it says email is delivered to recipients in this Exchange organization or relayed to an email server outside this Exchange organization. Use this setting if the domain is shared by this Exchange organization and another messaging system. So you might use an internal relay domain if two companies, let's say, are merging, or they have merged, but they haven't quite consolidated their Exchange environment yet under one single organization. So they might have the need for a consistent email addressing scheme across both environments, but still maintain separate environments. And so in that case, you would use an internal relay. So here's an example. Let's say Globomantics takes over another company called Avatar.com. So what happens when an accepted domain is set as an internal relay domain is that the organization is still set to accept mail for the domain. But if there's no recipient found in that organization, then it looks to a list of send connectors to determine where to send it next. And so you have to configure this so that this is the internal relay, the mail comes into it, but if you don't have a recipient on this server, it says, well, what do I do with it? Then it uses a send connector for the namespace and sends the email for the unknown recipients to the other Exchange organization that you know where it exists, so you can configure it to send it off to that other Exchange organization. Those users will get their mail, but they're not hosted within this Exchange organization just yet. So that's sort of a mix and match solution. The last solution there is an external relay domain. This is where the Exchange organization will accept mail, but there are no mailboxes in that organization for that domain. So it accepts the mail, but then uses a send connector to relay it off to an external namespace completely. So it's not like the internal relay domain where there may be recipients there and some are not. No, in this case, it will accept the mail and send it off somewhere else. So this is a solution that might be used when one Exchange organization is accepting mail from the internet, let's say, but it's accepting mail for a non-authoritative domain name. And then it forwards it on to the authoritative Exchange organization. And you might establish this not so much at the hub transport level, but more at the edge transport level in order to keep email for non-authoritative domains from entering your corporate network. So you configure this at the edge level and you send it off to an authoritative Exchange organization and let that Exchange organization receive the mail. So you might say, wow, there's a lot of different configurations here. It seems very complicated. Why not just set it up nice and easy the way we have it? Well, in actuality, even though it seems easy to start with, different companies and different configurations, different designs require different levels of flexibility. So this is just showing you how the Hub Transport Server role plays a part in providing that flexibility to your Exchange organization, and especially in situations where you merge with other companies and you need more flexibility, because without that, you're just going to pretty much have to scrap everything that you have and end up creating everything from the beginning. Now, you might be eager to do that as an administrator. Certainly, things seem to flow a lot better when you do that. But the hassle and the frustration, especially if you're dealing with a large merger, large number of users and mailboxes, it could just get out of hand. So you don't want to have to do that all the time. This gives you a lot of flexibility to accept mail for others and relay it off to them if necessary. But in our case here, we're doing fine. We have our authoritative domain. It's an accepted domain. We get email coming into it. We accept it. We have recipients right within our organization, and we don't have recipients anywhere else. So this is a nice, simple implementation of our Hub Transport Server and our domains. Okay, so we've really given the Hub Transport Server a good overview. We're going to move over to a discussion of the Edge Transport Server. So let's go back to our slides and let's look at an overview as to what the Edge Transport Server is supposed to do to help you to protect your organization. Okay, so now let's talk about our last server role, the Edge Transport Server. This server is unique when you compare it to the other server roles in that it's deployed not within your Active Directory, but rather it's not a member of the Active Directory. It's actually in your perimeter network. It's not included within your internal network. So it holds a very unique role, starting with the fact that it's deployed in the DMZ or the perimeter network, and then followed up with the fact that it's not a member of the Active Directory. Instead, you install the Active Directory Lightweight Services role on that Edge server. So you might be wondering, well, what do I do with this Edge Transport Server role? We've talked about it a little bit, but let's see if we can narrow down what the purpose is. The Edge Transport Server is used to apply transport rules from the perimeter. So you already saw how transport rules can be really beneficial if we apply them on the Hub Transport Server. Mail is coming in and out of your organization and it hits that Hub Transport Server. And so those rules can be applied universally because we apply them to the organization level and it affects all Hub Transport servers in your organization. Well, with the Edge Transport Server, it's a little bit different. With each Edge Transport Server, you need to make sure that the transport rules are configured. There's no connectivity between Edge Transport servers. So if you set up a transport rule on one of them, it doesn't automatically replicate over to one of the other ones. So that's something to keep in mind, making sure if you want the same rule applied universally, that all of your Edge Transport servers have those rules. And there's ways to accomplish that without manually going through and making sure you put that same rule everywhere. That's a lot of room for error if you have to manually do that on each one. So that's one thing that the Edge Transport Server is really good for, is transport rules from the perimeter. Another important feature is anti-spam, which is included with your Edge Transport Server. Now, you may decide that you want to purchase and utilize a third-party solution in addition to what's provided by the Edge Transport Server itself, and that's fine. That's totally up to you. There are 9 different anti-spam agents that are actually given to you. If that's not enough, which it might not be actually, then you can certainly install something else and you would put it on that Edge Transport Server. The other feature that you're looking for out of the Edge Transport Server is antivirus protection, which is not included at all with the Edge Transport Server. So you might start looking at third-party utilities. Microsoft recommends Forefront to handle the antivirus protection. Forefront is designed to protect your organization from a variety of different problems that may be coming your way, whether it be viruses or malware or something of that sort that comes in through your email. So Forefront is one tool you might want to check out. You might want to look at other tools. The Edge Transport Server is also good for address rewriting. You use address rewriting to provide a consistent appearance to recipients that are external to your organization when it comes to messages from your Exchange organization. So you can configure the address rewriting agent to modify the SMTP addresses for inbound and outbound messages. So it's a good solution to maintaining that consistent appearance regardless of what's going on behind the scene. This is really good for newly merged organizations. There may be several domains and you want to provide a consistent appearance of email addresses for those external recipients, but on the inside you may still have a mixed version of SMTP addresses and domains because you're still dealing with working out the merger and working out the configuration from the merger. So address rewriting is another great feature on the Edge Transport Server role. Now, beyond setting it up, which it's actually very easy to do because all you're doing is installing the lightweight directory services and making sure that you have all of the other prerequisites for your Exchange environment, then you install the Edge Transport Server role. It's the only role you can install on that server, and you'll see that the Exchange Management Console is unique to that Edge Transport Server because we only see the Edge Transport Server role when we're working on the Edge Transport Server. But now the goal is to create a connection back to your Exchange organization. Without that connection, there's no trust between the Edge Transport and the Hub Transport servers. So you make that connection, first of all, by using the Exchange Management Shell and using the new -edge subscription commandlet on the Edge Transport server to create an XML file. Then you move that XML file to the Hub Transport server. And then finally, you use the Exchange Management Console. You could use the shell as well, but it's easier to use the console to import the XML file on the Hub Transport server. And we're going to walk through those steps as well. So let's go over to our Edge Transport server, which we already have installed, and let's take a look at the Exchange Management Console, and you'll get a chance to see the difference. You'll also get a chance to see the 9 anti-spam agents that are included, and we'll take a look at creating that Edge subscription with our Hub Transport server. Okay, and here we are on our Edge Transport server. You can see right away that we're looking at the Exchange Management Console, and the console is very different because we don't have organization and server-wide configuration. In this case, we just have Edge Transport. We do have a toolbox, which is good, but the Edge Transport has everything right here that we need that we can configure. So here are the anti-spam agents we were talking about, and we can count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yep, just making sure. I know I said 9, and I wanted to make sure that that's exactly what we had, was 9 different anti-spam agents. And you recall that earlier we installed these on the Hub Transport server, so it's not that you can't have them on the Hub Transport server, but you have to go through that extra step of using the Exchange Management Shell to ensure that the agents are installed on that server. Here we have send connectors, transport rules, accepted domains, receive connectors. So these are all of the things that we would normally have to worry about with an Edge Transport server. And as you can see, it's really not a lot that it has to do. It has a very specific job, a very specific purpose, and a very limited set of things that you can work with. In addition, you can work with an ISO server, you can install Forefront, so there are a few other things that you can do in the perimeter to make your network more secure. But really what we need to do if we want to connect our Edge Transport server up to our Hub Transport server is create an Edge subscription file. Now when we create that file, there's information about credentials that are used during the process of communication between the Hub and Edge Transport servers that will be put into that file. Credentials are used to authenticate and authorize this connection between your Active Directory Lightweight Directory service and your Active Directory on the internal network. So we can't do this from the Exchange Management Console. We have to open up our Exchange Management shell. We're going to create the XML file. We're going to move that file over to our Hub Transport server, and then we're going to pull that file in and create that Edge subscription. Now, one of the things Microsoft recommends is that you delete that Edge subscription file from all locations once your Edge subscription is done. So it's not a good idea to keep those files around because there's a lot of important information that goes into that file. So once you're done, make sure that file is destroyed from both the Edge and the Hub Transport servers. So to create this file, we're going to type new dash Edge, and then we'll hit the tab key, and it brings us right to Edge subscription, space, dash file name, and we'll give it a normal file name. Let's say we put it in the C drive, and we'll just call it Edge subscription.xml, and then we'll end the quotes. We hit enter. It gives us a ton of information that we can read, and maybe the first time you do this, you should read this. But in our case, we know that this is what we want to do. We're going to confirm, hit Y for yes. Okay, so that part is done. Now, I'm going to grab that file. I'm going to move it over to the Hub Transport server. Let's go over to our Hub Transport server and we'll import the file. Okay, so we're back on the Hub Transport server, and we'll show you that in a moment with the Exchange Management Console. But you can see that we moved over the Edge Subscription XML document that we created on the Edge Transport server. So now, if we open up our Exchange Management Console, we see that we have the Hub Transport role here under the Organization Configuration node. We have the Edge Subscriptions tab, which currently we don't have any Edge subscriptions. So what we're going to do is click the New Edge Subscription action link here, and that will kick off the wizard for us. Again, you can do this through the Exchange Management shell, but this is not something that you typically do in bulk. So we're going to just do this here from the wizard. It asks about the Active Directory site. We click Browse. In our case, we only have the one default site. We'll leave it at that and say OK. And then it asks us about the subscription file. We click Browse. And we'll go right to our desktop. Grab that file and say Open. And then here there's a little link, automatically create a send connector for this Edge subscription. So we'll leave that and we'll click New. Okay, and it completed. So it gives us a little warning here. It's giving us some information. That's not a bad thing. That's actually a very good thing. It shows us what Exchange Management Shell command was used. It gives us information about being able to resolve the IP address for the DMZ Edge server and be able to connect to that host on port 50636. So this is something that we're going to have to make sure we have available through the firewalls. But ultimately, that was really the end of the process. So now we have an Edge Transport server that will handle the front line of mail coming in and going out of our organization. I don't know about you, but I feel safer already.